Welcome, Alan.
Thank you, Miller.
So nice to have you here. We go back for a long time, I would say, many years. And Alan Moore, for those of you who don't know him or haven't Googled him, he's an author and a designer. And we'll come back to the question, what is a designer later on, I would say, in our conversation, Alan.
Mm-hmm.
But and I think basically we are going to talk about your obsession. I would call it obsession on a thing called beauty,
mm-hmm.
and why beauty is so ultimately important for everyone and for every business also.
Mm-hmm.
But before we do that, I would, and also to properly introduce you, and I think it's relevant to first go back to your earlier books, and two of them, and I've learned an important lesson from those books. And the one lesson I learned is to take everything that you say and predict seriously. Because there are some predictions in your previous books, and I would love to start with your first one, Communities Dominate Brands.
Okay.
Which was, and you need to help me a little bit. Was it 2005?
It was. Yeah.
2005, and I think Facebook started around 2004. So probably you even haven't heard about Facebook at that time when you.
No, I hadn't.
No. So what is the basic? What was the basic message that you give in your book of 2005?
Well, so on the screen here, it was very interesting when I thought about doing this. But essentially, although this is very dry, this observation that I made that this incredible uptake of mobile telephony, the internet, the real kind of hunger, I think, for these digitally empowered, what I call network communication technologies, we're absolutely in the process of transforming our world. And you could see that, right back in, say, like the mid-90s. And I really believed it. I was working in Finland in the early 90s, and when I got to Finland in 92, the company I worked in had 3 mobile phones, and by the time I left in 95, the entire of Finland had a mobile phone. I mean, that's that scale of adoption. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time, and I had friends in Japan who was witnessing a similar type of change. And I was actually in the sort of right at the heart of media at that point in terms of marketing, advertising, broadcast. And you could see the profound effect that what this was happening. And of course, the reality is this was a very socially driven revolution, albeit technology is at its fore. But the revolution is always socially driven. And of course, then the other thing that I really picked up on was this whole thing about data. And I was one of the very first people to say that refined data would be the black gold of the 21st century. And of course, my loving message to media owners of broadcast and newspapers and magazines and anyone that made their money out of advertising revenue in one form or another, I kind of said, well, you need to engage. And if you don't engage, if you don't reinvent your business models, if you don't really look at what is happening around you, perhaps you're not going to be around for too much longer. And of course, lots of people kind of just sort of looked at what they saw as the early stage of this digital revolution and really thought it was just going to be a flash in the pan. But I was convinced, both by traveling the world at that time and also working in Sweden in the late 90s, watching the internet take off, and then seeing these two things. People then thought they would be like a motorway, that they would never really kind of join each other. And I kind of realized also that digital communication technologies would have the capacity to completely re-engineer entire industries. And I always said that actually when we get to money, that's when it gets very interesting. When we start to change the flow of money, things really start to change. And I think we're at that point now.
It sounds like a warning. I mean, the warning would be take the book on the beauty and the signal that you give to take beauty as a starting point of everything it's very serious, because if you're right, then, I mean, the assumption is, or maybe the third time you're wrong, but we'll find out.
Yeah.
Can you take us to your second book? I think it was 2011.
That's right.
Before we go to beauty and design.
So out of Communities Dominates Brands, we actually blogged then for quite some time, and we ended up generating about 1 million words, I think. And in that process, I realized that there was something actually happening at an even greater level, as in a sense, I don't know, just through the process of observation or osmosis, looking in a whole variety of different places and industries, what was actually going on, that I kind of said, you know, we've arrived at this adaptive edge of our industrial society. So No Straight Lines was essentially really a sort of 7-year project. It was heavily researched to really try and understand what was going on. And what I said is the reason why we've arrived at this point is that we face this kind of conflation, this kind of three things happening at the same time: the disruption to our social context, the disruption to our economies, and actually the disruption to all organizations, which are primarily designed on what we call an industrial model, whether that's in healthcare, schools, conventional businesses. Our idea of scale and scaling up was exactly the same. And what I could see is that we weren't, those organizations, the design of them, the very DNA of them, weren't actually designed to be able to adjust to the extraordinary changes that are going on in our world. And so I said, it's not business as usual. It's not going to go back to business as usual. And I think we face a design challenge of how we can design and think about, I don't know, our societies, our businesses, our organizations in a way that can really deliver for all of us universally going forwards. You know, I couldn't predict the global financial crisis, but in many senses, you know, it didn't surprise me. And I think now, so I said, you know, we've gone from a linear world where we kind of knew where everything was sort of working how it should work one way or another. And we are going to jump into, and I really mean that, we are going to jump into a non-linear world. And I think various things that have happened, us voting to leave Brexit, you know, Mr. Trump in the White House, the implications of, you know, still what is happening with the sort of digitalization of our world, means that I think we really do face a massive design challenge. And the more that we get on board, we're trying to think about then, so what are the models, the designs, the patterns that we see that allow us to be much higher performing as organizations, as businesses, whatever that is. And I think that is absolutely a combination of digital, of analog, of thinking very differently about the materials that we use and where they come from, to actually create organizations that perhaps don't look like anything we've known before, you know.
Well, if you take, I mean, the message of the book is clearly, you know, it's about disruption, and it was 2011. Now, the word disruption has become ubiquitous. I mean,
yes,
talks about disruption here, even in the boardrooms, and they tend to like disruption even. I mean, they're smiling about it. That being a fact, so how long will it take before people will use the word beauty in the same sense that we are now all talking about disruption?
Well, I think it might take another 10 years. Although it's interesting when I you know, if I talk, if I'm giving a talk, and I did one recently, and I looked at the audience and I said, do you know what? I think we've all had enough of ugly. That's all I said. And I left it hanging in the air, and you could really feel that being held onto. You could see the way that people's body language was, the way they looked at you, the way they reflected. And I think that, you know, from a UK perspective, I mean, obviously, we've gone through a global financial crisis. If you look at it from a socio-economic perspective, the middle class has really suffered. The lower classes have really suffered. In Britain, you know, we've had this ideology called austerity, which has harmed so many people. That's pretty ugly. I think you look at the rise of companies which are valued in their billions, but they run on a 0-hour contracts, gig economy type thing, where human beings are essentially the kind of the lowest common denominator to maximize the efficiency of the financial return. I think that's pretty ugly. And of course, our kind of political context at the moment seems pretty ugly too. And so, you know, I'm always hopeful. I'm you know, like there's a British comedian called Bill Bailey, and somebody said to him, "Bill, are you an optimist?" And he says, "Well, I hope so." And so I think that I hope that perhaps we will start to understand much quicker that in pursuit of beauty, actually we get to a better place much faster than if we resist that kind of concept. And in many ways, I think that's what my job is now, is to help people look again in the right direction and say, this is a place, I think, which offers huge opportunity.
Mm-hmm. So I see a clear line between all the books. We're now going to talk about your latest, Do Design. It's a solution, I think. It's more like could I say it's a how-to to solve these no straight lines issues if you take beauty as a lens for everything that you do.
Yeah. So the thinking in should I move on to the next slide, or are we happy to stay?
Yeah.
You know, so what I believe fundamentally is that if we are going to really move forward, if we're going to thrive as a species, as a humanity, if we are going to thrive, therefore, as individuals, if we're going to thrive in whether it's in healthcare, whether it's in education, whether it's in, you know, all of the institutions and the industries that we require to function as a humanity, and if we're going to look after our planet, then it's down to every single one of us to take up that responsibility. Mm-hmm. And that's why I think beauty as a lens is extremely important. Equally, I think that it's a how-to guide in terms of how to tune yourself up, how to think about your personal responsibility, but also I think how you could then function as a business or an organization to take advantage of how that lens could help you think about designing and creating in much, much better ways, you know. Yeah.
Okay, could we, I think it's time to get some examples of your thinking.
Okay.
Also, because I mean, the message is clear. It's beauty is everything, and it can be applied in every area, which is basically what you're saying in your book.
Yeah, and I think just to reiterate, I mean, as the concept that beauty is foundational to all life. So there's a guy called Frank Wilczek. He wrote a book called The Most Beautiful Question in the World. He's a Nobel Prize winning scientist, and his question was, is the world a work of art? And he says that at the most fundamental level of our universe, at a cosmic level, the laws of the universe are essentially about harmony and symmetry. And of course, there's a guy called Edgar Mitchell, who was one of the early astronauts who flew to the moon, who realized as he was looking at the Earth, the Sun, and the Moon at the same time through the window, which must be an extraordinary experience, he realized that, you know, we are made up of all of the same molecules. So for me, that idea of beauty is absolutely really about the idea of deep design in terms of everything that we are and everything that we can do. And sorry, I just thought it was a very important point to make,
Yeah.
rather than people maybe making the assumption that what I'm talking about is aesthetics,
Yeah.
and just something about how something looks. So this is much more than about style, which is very, very important to me.
Yeah.
Okay.
They are related, I would say, in some way, but it's another area where to apply and how to apply beauty.
Well, they all flow into each other eventually, but it's not either or, it's and, as my friend likes to say.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to understand that beauty can play that very important role in every aspect of, who we are and what we do.
Well, in the different arenas in your book, I've got it here.
Yeah.
You can see it in the slide here. You talk about things like purpose, or processes, or utility, leadership, system. So it's everywhere. But let's take a few of them.
Sure.
So and maybe start with leadership, because that's the most fuzzy one. Could be most of the most fuzzy one. Or the most ugly one, I don't know.
Yeah.
Either way.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts about how to apply beauty and leadership?
Well, so the first thing I think is that, as the image sort of says here, radical trust creates beauty. I mean, and obviously I've used the safety pin because, it's a thing that we put closest maybe to our children when they're very, very young, perhaps not now, but, when we were kids, this would be used to, hold up a nappy or something, or a dress, or whatever. And so, and this thing has been designed with great care to protect, but it still needs to do a certain type of job. So just as I use that as an example.
Do you mean in a way like a child has got blind trust in the mother, for instance? It's like
there's a deep trust there. There's an absolutely deep trust there. And when that comes to leadership, that all starts with conversation. Now, obviously, I'm showing a picture from The Incredibles, and this is Elastigirl, so people are going to say, well, what's going on here? And this is a story about Pixar, which I think is very interesting, in that after the success of Toy Story 1, I think 60% of the firm was off with repetitive strain injury. It was a $1 billion hit. Disney then started to make a move to want to acquire Pixar, and Steve Jobs knew that this would happen. But Ed Catmull, who was actually the CEO of Pixar, realized that, as he said in his words, he said, every movie we start with sucks. And but our ambition is that every movie we make should be a $1 billion movie. And he realized that the only way that they would achieve that is to collect and harness the skills, the knowledge, and the insights of everyone that is working in that company. So they created a thing called the Brains Trust. Think about it like a Knights of the Round Table, but these people are in animation. Normally, the model in Hollywood is I would go to you, Menno, and I'd say, Mr. Van Dorn, I'd really like to make this movie. It's going to cost me $250 million. And you'd say, right, Alan, here's the check. You write it out. And as you're writing it out, you say, here's the contract. And by the way, you have to do everything I now say. And the reality is I don't really agree with what you're saying. And essentially, you're rewriting the script and you're dictating to me what I'm going to do. So actually, my morale goes. My head of production leaves because they can't stand what's going on. There's a lot of conflict. And essentially, the movie fails and you don't get your money back. And this is called what is called director's notes. In the Brains Trust in Pixar, people come into a room, all invested in the production of this movie. The director is there, and he receives feedback. Everyone is allowed to say what they want, and the rules are you have to speak candidly and openly, but you can only speak with constructive insight and points of view. You can't say this script is rubbish. You have to give something back into the process. The director listens and quite importantly is he can choose to or not choose at all to take on board the comments that people are making. But, you know, so what this shows is that conversation, which is essentially then the DNA of any organization, how we communicate, how we are organized in a sense, can work in a way where leadership can allow everyone to lead, to be autonomous, to be masters, and I think work with great purpose, which ultimately means that people are invested in the best possible outcome for that piece of work.
So could this design principle of brain trust, for instance, work in a French company or a German company? I'm just making a joke now, but
But I think
on the culture.
Yeah, I think it, you know, could it work in a UK company? I think that you know, we are trained in perhaps in some ways, or to be invested in with hierarchy or control, that you know, power sits at the top and it kind of rolls down. But I actually think this is a universal human principle.
So is beauty the answer for disengagement?
So beautiful conversations. My answer, my point here is beautiful leadership is built on creating conversations so that it can be open and candid. And there must be rules. You know, I think there's some very simple rules in terms of how this works. But I think what it allows is people to really give all of themselves to working on something in the knowledge that their dignity and their sovereignty is respected, rather than only giving so much away because actually they're concerned about the implications of what might happen if they challenge a certain, you know, group, if they challenge a certain form of hierarchy, and that sort of seems to me it's a way of working, but it's potentially not the most beautiful way of working. There's another way, I think, of thinking about leadership, and this idea again, it links into that they flow, which is openness. And what we see is where open and participatory collaborative platforms. Here, I'm using an example of Scientific Commons, where again you're allowing people to aggregate knowledge and information and then rapidly share that knowledge and information in completely different types of ways. And I think that this is something which is pressing in terms of maybe how we could think about the design model of businesses or enterprise models even, that actually could give much greater energy and speed to the way that something functions and the way that it performs. And in many ways, this is completely the same to the story about Pixar, except that it's functioning in a slightly different type of way. There's that, if you look at nature, you ask the question, why does nature thrive? Well, nature thrives because she's open. She shares knowledge and information, energy, in a whole variety of different ways, which are all incredibly networked. And I think that's it's a very interesting sort of design point.
And about the end product, for instance, if you talk about open source software, I mean, it's based on the principle of openness and open communication.
Yes.
So would you say that's in the end delivers a better product than the closed way of working?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the in terms of technology and scaling it up, of course, there's the very famous hacker's mantra, which is with many eyes, all bugs are shallow. And there's a limitation. This may sound contradictory in some respects. We require us all to be craftsmen. You know, the director, say, of the Pixar movie, you know, he has to be a master craftsman. But that's not to say that we can't learn, and that's not to say that all of us have blind spots in one way or another. If we have many eyes on the same problem, but it's being looked at in a much flatter hierarchical sense, I think that actually getting those bugs fixed and those things worked out happens at a much greater rate. And so I think there is an argument for a form of openness. I mean, obviously, you have to be mindful, I think, of what you're being open for, how you're inviting people in. You know, so again, it's not just, well, I'm going to open my front door to the street without any kind of rules of engagement. There always has to be rules of engagement. But I think also about, you know, the example here of Elon Musk last year, where he gave away all of his patent technology for his batteries, because what he wanted was an extraordinary acceleration of the money and the knowledge and the skill of more people coming into building that momentum behind hybrid cars, or cars that are running not on fossil fuels.
So what do you think? Does Elon Musk need to read your book, or is he already a master in beauty?
He may be in some aspects of it. I think he definitely should read my book, is what I would say. I mean, they've obviously got some really big issues in terms of scaling the factory up to function, as I understand it. And he's putting a lot of pressure on his workforce. Sometimes you read things in the newspapers and you wonder why it's been written and who's written it. But you know, I think he's someone that is genuinely invested in change, which is within the principles of living in a non-linear world. You know, we still need to move around on this planet. I don't think anyone wants to go back to sitting on a donkey. I don't know if we had a virtual show of hands in our audience now, you know, who would like to go back to, you know, 4 wheels or just your own 2 feet. And it sort of takes us to, I think, that place about augmentation, that beauty in terms of, say, leadership, of the things that we've looked at in, say, 3 very different types of ways, is about augmenting our performance as individuals, as businesses, and as enterprises, even as industries, to be able to deliver much better than what we currently do.
I hear you talk about beauty. This is sort of acid test question for you. When you enter the arena of, let's say, the boardroom of any company, and you come and talk about beauty, would it be a tendency that people would say, this is all flower power, you know, love, peace, and beauty, and let's go back to normal or something, you know, that kind of response? Is it? Are you? Is that a response that you sometimes get, or so? How fast are people into your concept?
Well, I mean, I think that you know, we did something together, as you know, with Husqvarna earlier in this year. These are pretty serious guys, I would say, who make some pretty serious equipment. And I think that the way that I structured the introduction to this, I think the feedback that came was as they took it very seriously, and it asked some very powerful questions about purpose, about leadership, about maybe the way that they do, you know, innovate even and organize themselves. I think that it's how you do meaningfully construct the proposition. And I think people, whether you carry yourself with the fact that you really truly believe in what it is you're talking about. Of course, there will always be people that resist. I mean, sometimes aggression in boardrooms is associated with people knowing the truth, but they just don't want to admit it. That's something that I've experienced, you know, over the last, 15 years of my life.
I've never experienced it.
Haven't you? So yeah, so when you're, I think that, there's, I think when you're really not, to be dismissed is just someone to say, I just don't believe in your idea. I think that, and then we'll put down a strong argument as to why that is. Then quite clearly you failed to convince them that this is important. I think when you're met with a lot of ferocity, a lot of anger, of course the root of anger, the taproot of anger is fear. That's the motivator. And but you know, I think that I don't know. I was asked the other day by a CEO, and he said, you know, do you think that design and beauty could help us think very differently about how we approach some of the challenges we face coming along the road? And I said, well, you know, sure, there are lots of ways other ways that you could do it, but why would you want to do it that way? You know, this is something that should be more enduringly satisfying, not only to you, because we can look at it from, you know, both ends of the spectrum of, say, the reason why the business exists, so its purpose, how it organizes itself, what are its enterprise models, but ultimately, what are the experiences that you're creating for your customers? You know, if something is joyful, if something is useful, if something is really valuable, then we know that people are far more likely to want to recommend those to their friends, far more likely to forgive a mistake, we'll want to come back for more of the same, because that has been a much, much better experience for them.
Yeah. So another argument for going on, taking a customer on the road of beauty could be business, simply said business, or you know, success that they want to have with their products and services. So could you explain so if a company comes and says, okay, how do I apply beauty in a utility or in a service or in a product? So what are you actually doing?
Okay. Well, should we look at some examples?
Yeah, please.
Okay. So there was a famous Englishman called William Morris who started what was called the arts and crafts movement many years ago. His mantra was, have nothing in your house that you believe to be neither useful nor beautiful. And I think this idea of beautiful utility is absolutely something that is eminently possible. This is a company called August, and they make locks. Locks for your front door and internal locks. But the interesting thing is that these locks are enabled through mobile technology. And what they've done, in fact, is they've built a whole enterprise model around this idea of opening and shutting doors. The locks themselves, the physical locks themselves, are beautifully engineered. I think they're beautifully designed. They feel great in your hand, but actually they are part of some very interesting technology. And so, you know, this would be something that I would be saying to someone, which is, how do you take something which is everyday? How do you take a common object, and how do you turn it into a work of uncommon grace? And I think August, in many ways, is a great example of doing that. I would want to take people on a journey, whatever it was that we were looking at, and saying, so where is the innovation that we can look at? What are things that are happening in manufacturing, in materials, in textiles, in technology, where we could start to think about an entirely different way of where we can give something which is of a higher order of utility, a higher order of experience, but also gives us potentially a way of generating sustainable revenue in a completely different type of way.
So how many companies would you say are getting this? Because I mean, we're talking here about the Internet of Things and the hype around it and connecting everything to the Internet. But, you know, there's a lot of energy put in just getting it work and you know, connecting it, and there's a lot of tech and digital stuff. So at what moment does the beauty concept comes in?
Well, I think the beauty concept has to come in at the very beginning, and I think it's a sustaining lens in terms of, is that the most beautiful thing that we could create? And that doesn't have to necessarily be associated with how much money we're spending at all. You know, Zero, I think, is a very, very interesting example of a company which is essentially transforming the industry of accountancy. I think they're valued at something around about sort of $1 billion at the moment. But they talk about beautifully designed software. And I think what's very interesting with Xero is perhaps actually I could use a comedian's joke. So there's a guy called Bill Bailey, and Bill's asked how he comes up with his jokes, and he says, well, I start with a laugh and I work backwards. What is it I need to do to create that amount of laughter? And Xero, I think, have done that. So you might say that the beauty in this instance starts from what's the most beautiful thing that we could create in response to the challenge that we currently face. That's a real designer talking, I think. Whereas I think what limits a lot of organizations is risk mitigation, which is increasingly becoming a kind of part of the fabric of large organizations. And also then the sort of fear factor of failure. So innovation inside big companies is associated somehow with failure in a way if it doesn't, but we need to guarantee, and you kind of go, it doesn't really work that way. That's what innovation is supposed to be about. And I think that I've written a little bit about Xero, and I've said, accountancy, and we all have to do it, is as ugly as nits. The stuff you get in your hair. It's not fun. It's not enjoyable. And yet I watch a local gardener, use Xero now as his means of sending invoices and the ability for them to simplify the experience, to automate the experience. And you can see that they've been able to do that because they've not said, well, we want a traditional accountancy company. In the same way that I actually worked on the design of a virtual law firm, which got voted into being in the top 50 most innovative companies in 2013. And the same thing applied, I suppose, in the conversation with one of the founders. And I said, you are no longer a conventional law firm. You are as much a technology company as you are a law firm. So if you also look at Xero's board of directors, they're not all accountants. They have people from Microsoft, they have people from PayPal, they have people from Google. They've got people that have multidisciplinary skills in mobile payment technologies, in cross-border banking. And so they've taken a lot of the ugliness of accountancy and they've really addressed it through programming and design. And that's why I think that beauty plays such a fundamental role in the design of that business. A really good example. And then I think another one is this actually free service, which is a piece of artificial intelligence. If you get a parking ticket, this thing will find the parking ticket for you for free. Right.
So how many times did you use it?
I've not used it yet. I'm a very careful parker, Menno.
You should. You should for research sake.
For research,
park your car.
Yeah, well, maybe within the group of people we've got on the call, they could all now go and get a parking ticket.
Yeah.
And then we could set up a brains trust, and we could see actually what happened, whether this was set up. So this was designed by guys at Stanford University, and literally this is the screen. You type in parking ticket. And I put in parking ticket UK, and then it comes up automatically find a parking ticket. Right. So I think there's real beauty in that type of thing. You can imagine. I mean, I'm sure again. I mean, I can remember being on my motorcycle in London, and the wheel of my bike, the tire of my bike was, I think, ½ centimetre over the yellow line. And I got a parking ticket for £70. And the guy took a photograph and he said, well, you've broken the law. And I said, well, you're being a little bit, and so what do? Do you fight it? Do you not fight it? Most people don't fight it because it's just not worth the aggravation.
I can see it still hurts.
Yeah. Yeah, well, you know.
Yeah.
So yeah, but I think there are three really good examples of
Yeah.
beautiful utility
Yeah.
where beauty is integral, I think, to many aspects of what it is that we're making. I think.
Now, I know you have some examples about manufacturing, but before we
Yeah.
finish up with that, I would like to ask you the question because you're familiar. You know that we are on the track of our new research topic on happiness, and although these are different concepts and different words, there is a similarity, I would say, between the two. It's because it's all in the eye of the beholder, or maybe in the heart of the beholder, what happiness or beauty is. So what's your thought about the similarity, or maybe the things that make them different as in a perspective, happiness or beauty?
Well, I think happiness. I was going to say that in my initial reaction is that beauty is a kind of more overarching, maybe a concept.
Mm-hmm.
But then, as I was thinking that, I was thinking about happiness and asking someone, "Are you truly happy?" And you know, and that's a deep-seated thing. You know, we all know that human beings, it's like we have light and day. For some of us, we sometimes struggle to stand in the light of ourselves rather than the shadowland of ourselves. You know,
Mm-hmm.
the shadowland is unhappiness. So I think they're equally deep in many ways. I think they are. I think they're definitely different. I think for me, as a design principle, beauty is something that gives more shape and depth for me to work with, rather than happiness, because I think also happiness is maybe a context or an end result of an experience. Also, I mean, that's the other side of it.
Yeah.
You know, is beauty the starting point and happiness the output at the end of the day? Maybe is that something, you know? But
I think in the example that's right in front of me on your slides, I could argue it's both. I mean, I know your story, but maybe you can share it. And then, I mean, the beauty is in the whole concept of the design of what we see here. But I think people are happy when they use it.
Oh, absolutely. So this is a garage, a multi-story car park in Aarhus in Denmark, but it's the largest automated multi-story car park in Europe. And what this man has done is he's driven into a well-lit area above ground. He parks his car, he locks it, he presses a button, he gets a ticket, he walks out, and then his car goes down into the multi-story car park. It sits on a fully automated trolley system. So the only thing it touches actually are the wheels themselves. And then during the day, it calculates constantly the likelihood of when this person's going to come back. So actually, when he comes back, he presses his button, or puts his ticket in, that car will be delivered to him within a minimum of, say, 5 minutes. So I was actually in Aarhus last year or earlier this year with some friends of mine, and they actually took me to this garage, and I watched a family of 4 get out of this car, mum and dad, 2 kids, and they were happy. They were joyful. They were amazed in many ways at how this thing functioned. But also, there's all sorts of things which are, it stops traffic queues. Of course, there's no crime. It means that, you know, individual women late at night, you know, no longer have to walk into a poorly lit multi-story car park, or a man for that matter of fact, in fear of being raped or mugged or both, or, you know, whatever. And so this is, again, a great example, I think, of a really beautiful concept. which has really been followed through, incredibly well designed, but brings great happiness and joy to people that use it as a consequence of that, I think.
Yeah.
You know, I'm amazed because, you know, I live in Cambridge and we are, in parentheses, the Silicon Fen of Europe. This is where the really clever people hang out. We don't have an automated multi-story car park.
Yes. It might.
I wish we could. You never know.
So the last, I think the last question, and we might have some questions from the participants here, but I like this manufacturing view of beauty. And there's a whole piece in the book, but that's for another time, maybe about the present continuous, the ing words that you play with and you find so important. So why is this doing so important in your concept of beauty?
Well, I mean, actually, it was that came out of a symposia that we ran earlier this year in Amsterdam, with hosted at SogetiLabs offices, and we asked a whole group of people to come along and spend some time thinking about what does it mean to be a beautiful business. And at the end of the session of the day, we asked people that came from some quite serious businesses to give their view on what they thought beauty meant to them. And actually, there was a guy that worked for a very large institutional pension fund, and his view was, beauty is a verb. And I was really taken by that because I thought there was actually great poetry, but truth and insight in that. So if beauty is a verb, what is your ing? So it's to do, you know, to do beauty. How do you become beautiful? You know, and he then talked about actually beauty was a lens for them in which they could look at their investments, which maybe would help them get deeper insight and knowledge and understanding in a way which previously perhaps they wouldn't have done. So, you know, whether it's coding, designing, you know, organizing, painting, soaring, banging, whatever, we can do all of those things with beauty. And I think that that's an extremely relevant way of thinking about how you bring that as a practice into all aspects of our daily lives, actually. Yeah.
In writing code, and I think the people here in the attending your webinar, there's always a conflict between writing the most beautiful code and time, maybe. If it's, you know, always someone knocking on the door, you have to deliver tomorrow. So there's also a tension, I would say, between doing everything in the most beautiful way and, you know, rushing through life. So is there any advice that you can give?
Well, I mean, of course, I mean, you know, as a young man, I worked, you know, I've done my, you know, 4 days round, you know, 4 days without any sleep. You know, fueled on pizza and Red Bull and, you know, whatever else. And you kind of, you know, you kind of somehow think when you're younger, that sort of way of earning your spurs, and you become more adult in doing those things. And perhaps sometimes there are situations when you've really got to do that. I think, however, that there is an argument as I've got older, which is sometimes it takes the time it takes to do the thing that needs to be done well. And I've been in many situations where I've seen a lot of rush, and my experience has said, and I remember this is a very clear one, and I said to this particular client, I said, the people that you have brought into this project will not deliver the work either on time or to the quality that you require, and that is going to cost you. And I was ignored for about 8 weeks, and then the penny dropped that the people that they'd hired could not deliver the work, you know, to the quality they wanted it. And of course, then, you know, the proverbial shit hit the fan. What do? We're now in crises. And I think that sometimes, therefore, you know, the beautiful, you know, part of the beauty is to ask the hard question, or to say, look, you know, if we push now, we'll end up being in a situation where we have to patch this, where actually it's going to be weak. It's not going to be at the level. We're just going to have to, you know, ring fence this. And I think being able to adjust maybe, or to understand, and having the courage to say, look, we need to do this now with the time it needs to take to get this right, because this is foundational to this entire, you know, project. I mean, I think that would be my lesson, my wisdom, my advice. It may well be that, you know, or if we have to run on a 24-hour clock for 7 days, we can't expect a team to do that, and we now need to start to think about a relay. So could we use a global network of people that actually could start to work on a project whereby we run at optimum speed, but what we're not doing is we're killing the human beings which are trying to sort of do the work at the same time. Because actually, what is that about? That's as much about protecting the project and the outcome of the project as it is about protecting the people that are working on it.
I think it's a nice summary of your what you wanted to say about the craftsmanship and how you make stuff. And looking at the time, because I think we're almost it's 5 and we have a hard close at 5.
Okay, no problem.
I can see whether there are any questions from the participants. The Pika is...
Right, we do have a few queries from our attendees as well.
Okay. So can you tell me what the questions are, because I can see.
Right. We have the first query from Jack, who says, the notion of beauty is so far from technical people in their professional world. How to get the message across for this category of people?
Okay, so I'm sorry this sounds like a cheap shot, but I would say read my book, because I got an email from a guy the other day. His name is Alex, and he was a UX designer, and he said, you know, I'm an absolute techno geek. You know, my world is technology, it's nothing else. He said, but your book has changed the way that I think about how I work. And I think that, you know, that idea of exploring what beauty may mean, but and the way that I've done it in a way is not telling people how it should be done, as much as creating space for the individual to have personal philosophical reflection on what it means to them. But there's been a lot of tech people that have read the book that have really responded incredibly well to it. So that's what I would say as a shortcut. It's only 10,500 words as well, so they don't have to spend too long reading it.
Okay. The next one is from Chris Ant, who says, I think the pressure that Elon Musk puts on his employee is sometimes ugly, but the result of his companies and his vision are beautiful, as I see it. How do you see that? Is it possible to use ugly to come to beauty?
Right. Sorry, I just missed the first part of that question. So could you mind just repeating it, if that's okay?
Sure.
Yeah.
Says, I think the pressure that Elon Musk puts on his employees is sometimes ugly.
Yes.
But the result of his companies and his vision are beautiful, as I see it.
Yeah.
How do you see that? Is it possible to use ugly to come to beauty?
I think it's a really good question. And of course, the reality is that nothing ever lives in perfection. And we might say that beauty is perfection. Beauty can be very hard to attain. In fact, I think it's the hardest thing to attain. I think he does push his staff very hard, although it's very hard for me to comment in the sense of things have come out, stories about the factory. We know that they're under a lot of pressure, as I mentioned it earlier. But I think he's a very aware leader. He's a very driven human being. And I think that he will take it very seriously about the consequences of some of the things that are currently going on. Sometimes we go through periods of pain as an organization, partly the discussion I have with Menno in terms of, how hard do we push people to get to, a good outcome, prevalent particularly within the tech world. I think that that's acceptable on the basis that one is, or a leadership team is aware of what is happening and are prepared to constantly adjust and understand and develop with what is happening. If they can keep the lens of how do we, what's the, we're working for a beautiful outcome, but I think that any means to arrive at it is not justified. So, we have a company, well, let's say Uber, for example. I think the way that Uber has designed Uber serves a fantastic need. There's a huge need for Uber, but we don't need an Uber that treats its staff and or actually its drivers in the way that it does. And I think that's ugly. And I'm prepared to put my hand on my heart and make that statement. And I think that's a very enlightened form of leadership, in my view. I hope that helps as an answer.
Okay, we'll not take a Uber chef. Any more questions, Tika? Shall we close now? It's 5.
We have 2 to 3 more queries.
Okay,
Menno.
you pick the most interesting one. The last one.
Okay. It's about Tysus, who's mentioned, to play the devil's advocate, what are the disadvantages of doing beauty?
What are the disadvantages of doing beauty? I mean, personally, for me, I think that beauty has a language which is about making things meaningful, valuable, useful, restorative, that you create, things that potentially have the ability to be immortal, that you create legacy within your organization, that in one way or another you bring happiness and joy to either your workforce or to your customers that you want to buy your products and services. I don't know what the downside of that is, quite frankly.
I think that's a nice way to end the conversation. Stick to it, I would say. Stick to your beauty.
Thank you very much.
And thank you so much for this very insightful and nice conversation that we had. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I enjoyed it. Cheers. Bye.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us in today's webinar and for your time.